Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel. Can you quickly disprove evolution as the origin of life? Well, real scientists should be able to, but they have a tendency to overlook the facts in order to accept a particular theory that's widely believed by scientists, even though the facts don't support it. But before we go to the facts, I'd like to talk about some probabilities. A lot of people, when they argue against evolution, say, look, for evolution to happen, you have to have a bunch of amino acids. They all have to line up correctly. They have to be in the right sequence for proteins to exist. Since amino acids randomly are produced 50-50 in the labo form and the dextro form, and for them all to be laid out, they all have to be the L or the labo form. This is so improbable that it's impossible, and therefore this could not happen. Therefore, evolution is not a proper explanation for the origin of the universe. Well, while that makes a certain amount of sense, and there's a lot of truth to it, on the other hand, you have people who believe in evolution, and they accept basically what they call the Drake equation, which basically says, look, there's a lot of planets, there's lots of stars, the planets have existed either eternally or for a very long time. That's long enough for random things such as amino acids to line up. Well, instead of arguing probability versus improbability, because both sides think probability is on their side, I'd like to actually talk about impossibility. For example, what would happen if all the amino acids were to line up in a proper sequence? Well, nothing, because amino acids themselves are not alive. Furthermore, they'd have to be lined up with various other biological materials such as carbohydrates and lipids at the correct time. And even if they had all that, it still wouldn't make them alive. Now, instead of accepting this, hardline evolutionists say, look, the Earth was probably different back then, there was different atmospheric conditions, and somehow because of that, we can ignore the law of biogenesis that says life only comes from life, and say, okay, what we're going to do is it became alive because something happened to the Earth. And if it didn't happen to the Earth, maybe it came from outer space and somehow got things to be alive. But even if you allowed for primitive life to randomly occur, it would still die out. Part of the reason for this is that even a single cell organism is so complex and so full of biological systems that scientists have learned that if you get rid of any of those systems, life cannot continue. Now, there's basically two types of cells. They are eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Now, as it turns out, most animals and most plants are made up of eukaryote cells, and bacteria and a couple other things are made up of prokaryote cells. But the point of this is to show you, and there are certainly more complex versions of this we could show you, but you'll notice they have a membrane, they have a nucleus, they have ribosomes and organelles, and both sides. They both have that. So primitive life has a lot of different complicating structures within it. Now, what about a protein? Well, this is a protein. Now, this particular protein is methionine, and you'll see it just consists, if you can see that there, of just a few atoms. These are not structures. These are not substructures. These are just a few atoms. They're not alive. They have nothing to tell it what to do. Now, if you happen to have all the amino acids that lined up, and somehow it became alive, what would happen? Of course, it would die. Now, why would it die? Well, one of the reasons it would die is it wouldn't know when it lined up that it had to have a cell membrane. Well, say, well, why does it have to have a cell membrane? Well, because cells contain intracellular water-soluble components. And basically, based on the laws of physics, if something is water-soluble, it will disperse or be destroyed in the presence of water. And pretty much all evolutionary theories that I've seen related to the origin of life say that life had to start in water. And one of the reasons they say life had to start in water is because we'd have to move around, somehow get to food, etc. And therefore, water is the more likely belief that evolutionists have in terms of how life got started, or where it got started. So you have to have a cell membrane. So if you didn't have that cell membrane, it would die. But okay, let's grant that this cell, when it's formed, for some reason, happened to have a cell membrane. What would happen next? Well, the cell would die. Now, why would the cell die? Because the cell wouldn't have had the DNA and the nucleus structure in order to give it like the software or the instructions to tell it had to do things such as eat. because it doesn't have any reason to know what it was supposed to eat, because it wasn't programmed that way. When the amino acids come together, amino acids themselves come together do not perform or form DNA or those kind of instructions. But let's say for some reason the cell had the instructions to know that it needed to eat. What would happen? Yes, it would die. Now, why would it die? It would die because it would have to have ribosomes and other organs, digestive organs, in order to utilize the food that it somehow ran into and somehow found and somehow ingested. So it would die. Now, what if it even had those organs and it had the digestibility, and some reason it formed with the ability to know all of this? It would still die. Why would it die? Well, it would actually die out because unless it also at the same time happened to have instructions telling it how to reproduce as well as the ability to reproduce, it would die out. So with evolution as the origin of life, so-called origin, at each step of the early process, you're going to see that the life could not start, it would not continue, it would not be able to eat, it would not be able to reproduce. Those are not improbabilities, those are impossibilities. And that's why evolution is not accepted by those of us who are true biological scientists, as well as those of us who believe the Bible. Now, in the Bible, we're told that God made life, and He made it able to reproduce, and He says that God talks about that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, verse 28, and verse 29. The idea of an intelligent design or spirit being is really the only explanation that does not defy the laws and facts of science, scientifically provable knowledge. Scientists say that DNA cannot exist without proteins, and proteins cannot exist without DNA. Therefore, all of that would have had to happen at the same time. So this improbability becomes an impossibility because the DNA of itself can do nothing. It needs the proteins. The proteins can't do anything without the DNA. It had to happen together. And that would take a creative spirit being in order to do that. Life does not exist without direct divine intervention. By the way, God apparently expects humans to realize by looking at the creation that life was created by God and that God does exist. God inspired the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 20 to write, quote, "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." So, life of itself randomly did not spring up. But what about Charles Darwin? People have talked about him. He's considered the father of evolution, even though some primitive tribes believed in some version of it throughout history. Well, we might be interested to note what Charles Darwin said. Now, this is from The Origin of Species, chapter 6, and on the 2010 version edition I've looked at, it's on page 124. It said, quote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Well, that's what Charles Darwin wrote in the 1800s. Well, when you start to look at a cell in modern times, you say, wait a second, his theory breaks down. It's too complicated. There are too many components. What he said could not have happened by successive slight modifications. You have to have all of it at the same time. Now, interestingly, Charles Darwin himself seemed to acknowledge that life could not have started on his own. He actually seemed to agree and rely on the biblical account of the book of Genesis for at least part of it. I'm going to read something else he wrote. This is from The Origin of Species, a second edition and subsequent editions. Darwin wrote, "There is a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one." So in other words, Charles Darwin says, look, the way life started, a creator breathed into it, a creator started it. And now that part he definitely got right. And this, of course, the creator is God. Now scientists recognize that organisms must be self-contained, they have to eat, they have to reproduce, and that life doesn't just spring out on its own. Living matter could not have progressed to the point of eating, digesting, or reproducing without intelligence, software instructions, and there's no plausible explanation of how initial life of itself could have had any intelligence. No randomly occurring series of improbable and impossible events could have began life and started life as we know it. Only the acceptance of a creator God is the logical explanation to explain life. All the evolutionary evidence that sometimes they'll point to still does not prove that life began from non-life and somehow evolved into its present stage. The scientific evidence simply points to a different conclusion. The scientific evidence points to the fact that if you don't ignore the laws of science, that life had to have had a creator because it would not have made it through any of the necessary steps to go to life as we know it. Now, Christians realize that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the Bible teaches, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the facts of physics and biology clearly support that. Now, there are detailed articles at the www.cogwriter.com for those who'd like more information about this. And again, the facts of science, true science, support the idea that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and created life as we know it. It did not spring out of nothingness. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.